Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. So, good evening. I'm Jeffrey Collins, professor of art history and material culture. You know who I am. Anyway, Jeff Collins, professor of art history and material culture at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted on behalf of the director and my BGC colleagues to welcome you to this second Wednesday at BGC, which is also the 19th year and the 51st gathering of the Françoise and Georges Selz Endowed Lectures in 18th and 19th century French decorative arts, design, and culture. So, as I think is fitting for such a milestone, this year marks a new life for the Selz series under a new organizational umbrella. And I'd like to express my gratitude both to the Seltzes and to the new Department of Public Humanities and Research for bringing distinguished scholars of French visual and material culture to New York to assist us in our mission of studying the human past by studying the things that human beings have made, used, or adapted. Now, since that mission begins with materials, let me pose to you a question. What does wax mean to you? What do you think of when you think of wax? Is it wax candles, wax seals, or wax writing tablets? Is it wax paper, wax cheese rinds, or perhaps if you're an art historian, the lost wax casting in bronze or precious metals? As this list suggests, in some sense, wax is everywhere, but in another, it's nowhere, since it's more typically considered a means to an end rather than a technological or creative medium in its own right. And I hope you are already thinking of exceptions to this gross generalization, like Madame Tussauds. But it's precisely wax's seemingly peripheral position in the histories of art and science that induced tonight's guest to make it the focus of his doctoral dissertation at Columbia, entitled Before the Reality Effect, Wax Representations in 18th Century France. And it's from that larger project that today's talk is drawn. I think it exemplifies our speaker's commitment to bringing objects at the so-called margins to the very center of the conversation. Charles Kang is an old friend of BGC, having attended many of these Selz lectures, as well as reviewing my colleague Itai Weinrup's exhibition on ex-votos, including a few wax ones, in the online journal 18 that was co-founded by Selz alum Meredith Martin. Charles's string of degrees in art history from University of Chicago, Williams College, and Columbia might make it seem that he steered a narrow disciplinary path, quite the opposite. Charles has distinguished himself by a breadth of interest and expertise that transcends a single medium, time period, or geographical focus. Among his publications are studies of the edible landscapes or food installations of the contemporary Chinese artist Song Dong, published in Gastronomica, Journal of Food and Culture, as well as a forthcoming chapter on settings for the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Collecting. Charles's other great love is works on paper. While at Williams, he co-curated the exhibition Works in Progress, drawing in 18th and 19th century France. And most recently and spectacularly, he's been appointed curator of 18th and 19th century drawings at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, among the very first non-Dutch, and I believe the first non-European curator in that department. Is that correct? And I can add, having spent time with him there this summer, that Charles is already famous at the museum for his impressively rapid command of Dutch, a language that he had never studied before taking up that position. Mercifully, Charles is going to speak to us tonight in English, so please help me welcome him for his talk entitled From Wax to Paper, Antoine Benoit's Portraits of Louis XIV.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for the warm welcome and introduction. Before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming this evening to this talk. And I would also like to express my thanks to everyone at BGC for making this possible, especially Andrew Kircher, Laura Minsky, and Nadia Rivers. Okay, so. Encased in a deep gilt frame, about 34 inches high, the profile portrait of Louis XIV by Antoine Benoit emerges from a dark background. Made primarily out of wax around 1705, the presumably life-size head has a commanding presence, even though he is not directly addressing us. The sense of presence is compelling because the primary medium of wax evokes human skin so compellingly and convincingly. By showing a range of blemishes, inconsistencies, and imperfections on the surface, the wax imitates the form, color, and texture of epidermis in its bare state. The king's skin is dotted with pockmarks, while stubbles are visible around the mouth and along the jaw. At the edge of his eye is a pronounced crow's feet, and the nasolabial fold accentuates his sagging cheek. By imitating skin, the surface reveals history. The pockmarks evoke the smallpox that Louis survived as a child. To those familiar with period depictions of the king, the stubbles remind that he had donned a mustache in his youth. The wrinkles, the hefty droop, and even the sallow complexion indicate aging. The wax surface thus bears marks of growth and maturity, collectively evoking biological time. The sense of striking verisimilitude is further reinforced by the use of human hair and fabric elements. Note the strip of silk tucked in between lace and velvet. Now heavily faded, the ribbon was originally in the light blue color of the Order of the Holy Spirit, even though it is highly unlikely that the ribbon originally held the cross of the chivalric order. This cordon bleu, or blue ribbon, by virtue of its symbolic power, blurs the line between the original and the copy. Yet the object also lays bare its conceit by means of its frame. Although it is not entirely certain whether the frame is original, the rectangular format prompts us to address another point of ambiguity inherent to the object. Just as the object blurs the line between the real and the depicted, it also claims its position somewhere between painting and sculpture. In color and in relief, in materials other than oil, marble, or bronze, it defies the key principles of the two categories by then well established by the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. Since this object resurfaced and entered the collection of the Palace of Versailles, then the Imperial Museum of Versailles, in 1856, scholars have addressed it only as a novelty predating Madame Tussauds' waxworks by almost a century. Underlying their assessment is an assumption that Benoit's working process lacked artistic agency. Without any firm evidence, it has often been argued that Benoit took a mold directly from the king's face and then cast a wax compound in the mold to create a copy. Focusing on this presumed contiguity between the portrait and its sitter makes it easy to expect a lack of stylistic development and easy to dismiss this portrait as an example of a seemingly unchanging career. However, the object already indicates that the whole process was never quite so simple. A slight change in the viewing angle reveals that Benoit employed sculptural foreshortening to accommodate the relatively shallow relief. Even if the process had involved casting wax in the mold, it would have required further sculptural refining and painterly addition of tinted glazes and details. Indeed, an extant drawing by the artist, possibly a preparatory study for the relief portrait in question, suggests that the process involved more than a mechanical reproduction of the sitter's facial physiognomy. Composed entirely of marks made by the artist, the drawing allows the possibility that even the relief portrait, the only surviving wax object securely attributed to the artist, is part of a much more complex career. Today, I want to demonstrate that this profile portrait marks a transition in Benoit's career. A more complex object emerges when we re-examine Benoit's earlier activities as a specialist of life-size, full-figure waxworks, as well as the changes in his reception at the turn of the 18th century. He had earlier gained success through individual portrait commissions, as well as a waxwork exhibition known as the Royal Circle, or Cercle Royal, which featured Louis XIV's court and foreign dignitaries. Although these earlier works initially received much acclaim, especially from the court, they eventually lost appeal and ended up surviving in the records primarily as literary tropes. In addition, his brief involvement in the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture indicates that his chosen trade of polychrome wax sculpture could not easily be situated into established academic categories. It is in this context that I will address additional objects created by Benoit, objects that have so far received little attention. These two sets of miniatures and a manuscript album, produced around the same time as a profile wax portrait, allow us the possibility that Benoit was actively attempting to reframe his expertise away from the earlier, fully rounded waxworks. Just as the profile portrait challenges the distinction between painting and sculpture, these works, primarily on paper, bring forth another kind of categorical ambiguity. Simply put, they imitate the form of portrait medals and medallions while challenging the inherent properties of that particular category by means of their framing and polychrome. I argue that they de-emphasize Benoit's link to wax and instead claim a different kind of expertise as a chronicler or a recorder of the king's likeness over time. And that brings me to a question. Could an artist claim their legitimacy and prestige not by medium, but by having access to the king's likeness multiple times over the course of his life? Of course, no one bought this claim, but this story of failure does offer a rare glimpse into the limits of royal portraiture. The story also marks an important transition when polychrome three-dimensional likenesses fell by the wayside of royal portraiture and would later reemerge as a form of popular entertainment. And before I continue, I want to briefly acknowledge that in the spirit of the new format of Selz lecture, I just want to emphasize that this is a story that I have woven from a small number of objects, as well as sort of a widely scattered bits of archival evidence. So I really welcome your feedback and as well as comments and suggestions after this talk. Now, back to the presentation. Antoine Benoit was born in Joigny, in Burgundy, in 1631 or 1632. Earlier scholars have suggested that he was initially exposed to sculpture through his woodworker father, and that he at one point studied under a Mantuan artist specializing in figurines and medals. By 1659, he had moved to Paris and joined the king's household, that is, Maison du Roi, as one of 10 ordinary painters and a chamber valet to the king. He did not keep the post long. Records of household staff from subsequent years do not include him. By 1665, he was well established as a specialist of three-dimensional bust-length wax portraits. The best indication of his reputation is Gian Lorenzo Bernini's visit to Benoit's studio during the Italian master's sojourn in Paris, recorded in the diary of Paul Fréat de Chanteloup. While no work from this period survives, a later bronze copy after a 1670 wax bust of Suzanne Philippot, wife of the state councillor Jérôme Bignon the Younger, offers some clues to the kinds of works that Bernini must have seen in Benoit's studio during his visit. And of course, we have to imagine this bust in polychrome wax and additional materials, just like our profile relief portrait. There is much to be said about Bernini's visit, but I will limit myself to two salient points. First, the circumstances of the visit clearly indicates Benoit's renown at the time. Bernini had heard of the French wax portraitist first from Cardinal Flavio Chigi, who had been in Paris a year prior to Bernini as a papal legate. Chigi's suggestion likely carried additional import since Bernini was commissioned a portrait bust of Louis XIV during his stay. Moreover, the record mentions Bernini seeing wax busts of Duchess of Mazarin and Madame de Lyon, two women who were both linked to one of Bernini's key French supporters, Cardinal Mazarin. At the same time, the account of Bernini's visit includes a brief glimpse into Benoit's working process, or more precisely, how Benoit presented his working process to the much more famous, bona fide Italian artist. When asked by Bernini how he formed his heads, Benoit explained that, to quote, He made his composition of marble powder, ground eggshells, and plaster. That what is important is the amount of these materials, and the invention of the brilliance of eyes, and the care of finish. And the French term used here for finish is reparer. His comment explains that wax alone was not sufficient to depict human flesh, but instead required hard, powdery additives. They likely corrected the natural color of the wax and provided firmness and structure. More significantly, the comment focuses on the head proper, that is to say, the wax-based part of each portrait. Benoit omits any references to non-wax elements, even though his works from this period, according to surviving records, already incorporated real hair, imitation as well as real jewelry, as well as fur and textile elements for the costume. Even when discussing the wax-based part, Benoit remains selective. While the word reparer implies that casting from a mold was possibly the basic method of forming a head, Benoit emphasizes only the procedures that require his direct involvement, correct mix of ingredients, naturalistic depiction of eyes, and refining the cast by hand. Benoit's selective emphasis is significant because there was already some skepticism towards wax portraiture in established artistic discourses. The first volume of André Philibbian's Entretien sur les vies et les ouvrages des plus excellents peintres anciens et modernes of 1666, published only a year after Bernini's visit, includes a discussion of wax faces that one molds after nature. Although the author does not directly refer to Benoit, he is critical of the mechanical process of taking a mold directly from a face because the resulting mass, and here I'm quoting, truly preserves the resemblance and the form where it is found, but it is a dead and insensitive resemblance. Philibbian's goal here is to use wax portraiture as a foil against which to elevate the status of painting and sculpture as liberal arts. While it is unknown whether Benoit was fully conversant in the ongoing debate, his response to Bernini that I mentioned earlier demonstrates an awareness of the prejudice directed towards his practice. Benoit defines his expertise as specifically non-mechanical and points to his agency as the central aspect of the work. To the extent that he could legitimize his work to a renowned sculptor, Benoit was keen to exploit the commercial potential of his expertise as well. In early 1669, Benoit unveiled a work that would define him in historical memory. A waxwork exhibition consisting of full-length, life-size figures representing Louis XIV, his family, and key members of his inner circle. The artist had received a letters patent the previous year, granting him the exclusive right to reproduce such figures in wax. On the screen is a print etched by Jean-Luc Bautre depicting the so-called Cercle Royal, or the Royal Circle, by Benoit in 1670, the year after it opened to visitors, including Louis XIV himself and the Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, at the annual Saint-Germain Fair. The print, which likely served as an advertising leaflet, depicts 23 life-size figures arranged in a semicircle. An extended version of Benoit's earlier bust format, each figure likely consisted of the head and other exposed body parts in the artist's wax compound, a wooden inner frame, as well as a wig, a costume, and accessories. The sitters themselves determined how the figures would be dressed. In some cases, they even provided the materials for the costumes. While the Royal Circle did not survive, we can get a sense of how each figure might have appeared from a later work, a wax figure of Tsar Peter the Great from 1725, this is several decades after, commissioned by Catherine the Great and executed by the Italian sculptor Carlo Bartolomeo Rastrelli. While this rudimentary etching on the left does not differentiate individual figures, it nevertheless makes a convincing case for the naturalism of Benoit's work. It makes no effort in presenting the figures as a work of sculpture, as if the unknown draftsperson and Lepautre took advantage of the print medium to make them appear as true sitters. The inscription underneath the picture further emphasizes the ambiguity between reality and representation. And here I quote in translation, Benoit's creatures almost do not appear to be a work of fingers, and I believe that he would be able to brag unhindered that he would have done a great miracle if he had given them a voice. While acknowledging the specificity of the medium as a work of fingers, that is, modeling, the anonymous author highlights Benoit's quasi-miraculous ability by pointing out voice as the only missing element. A different letterpress leaflet, likely from the early 1680s and known only through a 19th century record of it, demonstrates that identification of individual figures was part and parcel of viewing the exhibition. Under the heading The Royal Circle, the sheet listed the names of figures without any illustration, but laid out on the page to reflect the arrangement of the wax figures. It was likely handed out at the exhibition and served as a key. Reports of Louis XIV's visit soon after the opening, published mainly for court audiences, offer further information about the exhibition. Adorned with finery and clothing, the figures replicated a social gathering at the Louvre. They thus, to quote, equal their greater originals, unquote, with all the brilliance, and the word used here is éclat. Given the emphasis on the opulence of these non-wax elements, it is likely that the sitters themselves, rather than Benoit himself, supplied the clothing and finery. Indeed, a record of a later private portrait commission indicates that the commissioner made separate payments for a tailor, a featherworker, a wig maker, a jeweler, as well as merchants for other accessories and fabric. And this commissioner was actually a Prince de Condé. It follows that the sitters of Benoit's circle performed splendor and magnificence, one of the principal concerns of the court culture at the time, through their wax doubles. What is striking about Benoit's waxworks exhibition is that he took an existing format of the wax effigy and put it in a new context. France already had a long tradition of creating effigies for royal funerary rituals, as demonstrated by the surviving wax bust of Henry IV. By contrast, Benoit's portraits were decidedly of the living, even though they could eventually survive the sitters. If the trope of the missing voice worked, it was because the figures were meant to depict contemporary persons. Indeed, the trope evolved into a working metaphor among social elites, the primary audience, or at least initially, of the royal circle. The salonière Madame de Sévigné, for example, used Benoit's figures to refer to a state of shock or speechlessness in several of her celebrated letters. Benoit eventually moved the royal circle to his residence on Rue des Saints-Pères, only a short distance from the fairground. The permanent installation became a lucrative source of income. The lack of direct commentaries in the subsequent years, however, indicate that the initial novelty wore off over time. Presumably to renew interest, Benoit added another portrait of Louis XIV to the circle in 1684. The announcement in the April issue of the Mercure Galant, the premier gazette of the time, once again emphasizes Benoit's agency by noting that, quote, the king, with his particular generosity, was willing to grant all the time that was necessary for Benoit to finish it. The announcement also indicates that by this point, Benoit had also produced portraits of other European monarchs. Period sources in the late 1680s indicate that the waxwork exhibition by then included more than the original circle. Benoit's renewed letters patent of 1688 granted an exclusive right to reproduce likenesses of, quote, ambassadors of Siam, Moscow, Morocco, Algiers, Genoa, and other courts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Very ambitious. Even with this addition of ethnographic flavor, however, Benoit's exhibition appears to have lost its appeal, as few direct references are found from this period on. What we do find instead is the use of Benoit's wax figures as a literary trope. One symptomatic case is found in La Foire Saint-Germain, a play that uses a waxwork exhibition as a central conceit of the plot. Florent Carton, a dramatist known as Dancourt, and at one point more popular than Molière, premiered the play at the Comédie Française on January 19, 1696. Set at the annual fairground of Saint-Germain, the original venue of Benoit's circle, the plot revolves around a sexagenarian financier who has been courting and promising marriage to multiple women. The victims decide to punish him by putting on a circle, an exhibition in which they pretend to be wax figures. Reversing the earlier trope of the missing voice, the women begin to speak one at a time and publicly shame the culprit. Addressing the Comédie Française's predominantly noble audiences, it conveys that by the end of the 17th century, Benoit's waxwork exhibition could still be noted for high naturalism, but it could only fool an old arriviste. Two other cases are also worth a brief mention. In April 1699 and July 1704, two foreign ambassadors visited Benoit's waxwork exhibition, the Moroccan ambassador Ben Aisha and the Tripoli ambassador Haji Mustafa Aga. In the description of their visits, the Gazette Mercure Galant emphasizes that they not only expressed their astonishment at the verisimilitude of Benoit's figures, but also condemned it as an offense to God. The Moroccan ambassador went so far as to condemn the Ottomans who, I quote, had let themselves be pulled in wax. And this, of course, refers to the so-called Ottoman court that was added to Benoit's exhibition at this point. The Mercure reports thus suggest that the royal circle devolved from its earlier aspirations to engage primarily with noble audiences. As late as 1679, Charles de Drouin, Prince of Guéméné, could still cry upon seeing Benoit's wax figure of his recently deceased wife, Marie-Anne d'Albert de Luynes. By 1704, however, it took two foreigners to extol Benoit's naturalism. The royal circle became part of entertaining narratives about cultural differences, entirely hinged upon a presumed and iconic tradition banning the creation of human likenesses. Still lacking a soul, the wax figure was now an act of blasphemy in the eyes of Muslims. Contextualized through the history of the royal circle, the profile portrait of Louis XIV from around 1705 emerges as a departure rather than simply a continuation of Benoit's earlier practices. Produced when the waxwork exhibition was losing its initial appeal, the portrait takes a different format. Neither fully three-dimensional nor full-length, the portrait does not attempt at the same kind of illusion. No one could mistake this as a live person. Before one can invoke a lack of soul or speech, as many period commentators have done with regard to Benoit's full-length figures, the gilt-wood frame of this portrait calls attention to the work's status as a form of representation akin to painting. Indeed, Benoit already had trouble reconciling his practice with the categories of art making established by the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. He managed to become a member of the Academy in 1681, but as a painter. By inducting him as such, the Academy chose to refer to Benoit's earlier position as an ordinary painter to the king, and I have to remind you this is how he actually started showing up in records, and the Academy elided the career in wax that Benoit had since developed over a decade and a half. He even submitted two reception pieces, two paintings, to qualify as a member, a portrait of the painter Gabriel Blanchard and one of the sculptor Jacques Biret. And even here, I might add, Benoit chose one painter and one sculptor as if to express his link to both arts. While Benoit appears to have been barely active in the Academy, his participation in the Salon of 1699 reveals much about his ambiguous position. This important exhibition featuring works by academicians had just been resurrected after a long gap since 1683. For this occasion, Benoit not only submitted his works, but also functioned as one of the three academicians in charge of the display. And here I'm showing a contemporary etching depicting the general ambiance. The positioning of Benoit's works within the exhibition was therefore especially meaningful. In the section on sculpture, the Salon Guide, or the Livret, lists 6 portraits of foreign visitors and a portrait of a Carthusian monk by Benoit. Yet the Salon Guide also notes that these works were painted, and the French term for this is peint, P-E-I-N-T, by Benoit, in marked contrast to nearby objects made by such established sculptors as Antoine Benoist or Françoise Girardon. And the French word for made is, of course, fait, F-A-I-T. The Livret entry thus suggests that Benoit displayed wax portraits which were either directly from the royal circle or copies. At the same time, the choice of language betrays Benoit's ambiguous position within the Academy. While his works were displayed as sculpture, the authorship was limited to its polychromy in line with his official status as a painter. The works could only be painted by him. It is in this context that I bring your attention to 2 other extant works by Benoit, which were produced around the time of the profile relief portrait and can be considered as primarily 2-dimensional. The first is a pair of elaborate gilt bronze frames from 1704, now at the National Library of France, containing a total of 20 miniature metal format portraits in grisaille on parchment, leather, and paper. Each elaborate gilt bronze frame, about 68 centimeters high, bears Benoit's signature, indicating that he designed the frames in addition to painting the portraits. Arranged in a pyramid, the portraits in each frame are surrounded by war trophies and vegetal motifs, and topped with fleur-de-lis, signs of the zodiac, and the sun. An inscription in the middle of each frame describes the set of miniatures. Titled Portrait de la Maison Royale, or Portraits of the Royal House, one set depicts 4 generations of the royal family from Louis XIII to Charles, the Duke of Berry, that is Louis XIV's grandson, as well as their consorts. Each profile portrait is surrounded by a gilded border announcing the sitter's name, title, and age. The other set, titled Portrait de Louis le Grand suivant ses âges, or Portraits of Louis the Great, following his age, and I really want to emphasize suivant ses âges, shows Louis XIV at 10 different points of his life. From the age of 5 to 59, the depicted ages are indicated on the gilded borders. The borders of the portraits all bear Benoit's signature as the painter, with the Latin word pinx, although some of them are executed after pre-existing portraits by Jean Varin, a prominent medalist during the earlier decades of Louis XIV's reign. Based on the depicted ages, we may presume that Benoit had started producing miniature profile portraits of Louis XIV and his family members as early as 1660, if we were to really believe what he's trying to tell us here, coinciding with the earliest wax busts by Benoit that we know of. The sets combine 2 groups of miniatures, those that reproduce portraits that he had executed before, possibly at the time of the indicated ages, and those that he created newly in 1704. That the portraits allude to medals is significant. The 2 sets in their frames originally belonged to the medals cabinet at Versailles, where the king kept his collection of antique and modern portrait medals and coins. 19th century sources point out an easel foot attached to the back of each frame, indicating that the frames originally stood on their own on an armoire or a large table. They were thus meant to be picked up and closely examined. The rich red silk that used to cover the backside, replaced in the 19th century, corroborates this possibility. Sharing the same space as models, the frames invited a similar kind of physical and visual engagement. Yet, Benoit's portraits do not technically imitate medals, for they do not have visible reverses. The verso of a medal or medallion would often include an emblem or a reference to a historical event, and as many scholars, including Robert Wellington, have amply demonstrated, medals were an important, if not the premier medium, for historical account during Louis XIV's reign. In Benoit's case, however, the reverse is kept hidden. If there is a historical event recorded, it is that of recording the likeness of each figure at a specific moment in time. The portraits thus do not simply depart from the royal circle in medium. They reorient Benoit's expertise as a chronicler of likeness following the ages of the king. His decision to incorporate pre-existing portraits by Varin suggests that Benoit might also wanted to position himself in a different and certainly more prestigious artistic genealogy. Indeed, Benoit went further and attached history to the portraits in the form of a richly bound and illustrated manuscript album. Also in the National Library of France, this understudied album from 1708 consists of 55 folios of text interspersed with gouache or body color illustrations. Each folio is slightly smaller than standard letter-size paper. Titled Histoire de Louis le Grand, the text is an early manuscript version of the king's biography by Michel David de la Bizardière, which would be published later in 1712. This manuscript version contains only minor differences from the later printed version, and I want to emphasize that the later printed version actually did not include any of these illustrations. The text, however, serves a secondary role. Instead, the exterior binding in lustrous blue velour with gilt bronze edging and latches immediately demonstrate that Benoit was in charge of the overall presentation. Both the front and back covers incorporate a medallion containing signs of the zodiac in a circular formation. It repeats the decoration of the 1704 frames, but corrects it further, for the sun is now located between the signs of Virgo and Libra. And I just want to remind you that Louis XIV was born on September 5th. And one other thing is that the medallion frames in the National Library, it's possible that the parts were dismantled at some point and then incorrectly reassembled. And I haven't quite figured out whether that is the case. The primary content of the album are 15 profile portraits in full color with gilding, of which 13 depict Louis XIV. 2 of them decorate the first and last folios of the album as separate plates. Each portrait is accompanied by a framed dedicatory inscription as if to show the verso of a medal. The remaining 13 portraits are divided to decorate chapter headings. While the first 5 portraits are indicated as after Varin's work, the rest carry the inscription ad vivum, from life, alongside Benoit's signature. The truth claim here is further reinforced by the accompanying text, which, even though written by a minor historian, traces major events of his life. While the portraits in this album are similar to the 1704 miniatures in format and size, the indicated ages suggest only 4 overlaps. When considered together, the 2 groups include portraits of Louis XIV at 22 points of his life, of which only 5 are after Varin. Whether the king actually sat down for Benoit 17 times is unlikely, and further is beside the point. By plotting the numerous likenesses of Louis XIV alongside a written biography, Benoit asserts his position as a follower of King's ages, if you will. That the album was given as a gift to the king, as indicated in the inscription on the last page, reaffirms the artist's attempt to define his expertise to his single most important setter and audience. The use of stippling dots for modeling and shading suggests that Benoit also had publication in mind. The wax profile portrait, depicting the king at the age of 68, finds its miniature equivalent in the 1708 manuscript album. It is in fact the first portrait in the set, accompanied by the dedicatory inscription on a discrete folio. Although it remains unknown which preceded which, the existence of the temporally specific likeness in 2 different media suggests Benoit's attempt to transition away from the waxworks exhibition, or perhaps to distill the temporal specificity of waxwork and impose it on different media. Presented like a painting, the wax portrait alludes to more dominant and prestigious art forms. It also marks his work as a form of historical documentation. We may even consider the possibility that Benoit intended a full series of profile wax portraits tracing the king's life. Post-1708 records suggest that Benoit did not produce anything new until his death in 1717. The third version of his letters patent, drawn up shortly before his death, indicates that the royal circle remained on view without notable additions, and that its operation was to be passed down to his son Gabriel. By the time Antoine Benoit died, some records referred to him as the painter of king and his unique sculptor in colored wax. The latter distinction, likely an invention of his own rather than an officially acknowledged one, did not help preserve his posthumous renown. After his death, Antoine Benoit's name almost completely disappeared. His metal-format miniature portraits, however, had a slightly longer afterlife. The National Library of France has 15 engravings, possibly proofs, mostly after portraits in the 1704 frames and the 1708 manuscript album, including the one of Louis at the age of 68. Some engravings combine the original portraits, and a few are after unknown originals. Engraved in scale by Alexis Loire, Charles-Louis Simonneau, and Jean Audrin, all portraits in this group acknowledge Benoit as the original designer or draftsperson. However, only a few include the age of the sitter at the moment of depiction. The omission of temporal specificity here suggests a more generalized use. Indeed, the portraits appear in the second edition of the Médaille sur les principaux événements du règne entier de Louis le Grand, published by the Royal Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres in 1723. It expanded upon the original 1702 edition by including almost all of the above engravings after Benoit among its 318 plates. If his portraits managed to be incorporated into an official history of Louis XIV's reign, it cost him his authorship. The publication entirely suppresses the names of designers or draftsmen and engravers. While Benoit might have been forgotten, soon after his death, waxwork as a category would continue to evolve. Paris would see another waxwork show comparable to Benoit's circle in 1783, when the German impresario Philipp Wilhelm Matthias Curtius opened a salon on the ground floor of the Palais Royal, featuring wax figures of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, as well as Philip, the Duke of Orleans, and Jacques Necker, the finance minister of Louis XVI. If Benoit's circle had transferred the earlier practice of wax funerary effigies into a secular context, Curtius's salon would witness a brief reversal of this history. On July 12, 1789, upon hearing the dismissal of Necker the previous day, protesters brought the wax busts of Necker and the Duke of Orleans out of Curtius's exhibition and paraded them in the streets of Paris. This was only the beginning of wax's involvement in the subsequent French Revolution, as wax figures would often be made of recently guillotined members of the royal family and the nobility. Of course, a key participant in the production of these waxworks was Curtius's protege and possibly his daughter, a woman eventually known as Madame Tussauds. Thank you.
So the floor is open and Charles will take questions. And Charles, when you indicate who you're speaking with, we'll pass around the microphone.
Sure. Perhaps could have the light raised a bit so I can see. Yes, here first. Yeah.
So my question is obviously Louis XIV cared a lot about his image and how he was depicted. So I was wondering if we have any idea how he would have felt about that portrait, as like you said, it does show like pockmarks and it shows like his age. Would he have liked that portrayal of himself?
I mean, it's a great question because we know that Louis was extremely vain. I mean, that is almost self-evident. And, there are sort of stories of, one of the reasons that Louis actually gets rid of his mustache, I think it was like around age 30 or so, was that it started to make him look old. So he was clearly concerned about sort of the appearance and its attachment to, or its association with this particular age. And we also know that even the court itself was actually quite invested, let's say, with the king's appearance. So one of the sort of fun, let's say, aspects of the discourse around Bernini's bust of Louis XIV was the nose was too big. So there's a whole bunch of discussions about that. So you see that both the king as well as the court in general were really invested in this idea of the perfect or the ideal sort of appearance and how that translates into the sense of the royal body, right? So I wish we had records indicating how Louis might have felt about this, but sadly we don't. So we can only sort of infer that perhaps he liked it, perhaps he didn't. But the fact that this particular object did exist means that he allowed this to be created. So that's as far as I feel comfortable sort of saying.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, the gentleman here.
I like to put dates. I like to put dates around everything, and so just to point out that as I'm just quickly cheated, Benoit was born in 1632, so he's 6 years younger than Louis XIV,
Yeah.
and died 2 years after. But also, I see that your initial the first part points to the year 1665, and so Louis XIV became actually king in 1660. So this is a whole escort throughout his reign. What did he do before 1660?
That we do not know. Like the earliest record, as far as I know, is precisely that. Excuse me, just 1 second. I think the earliest record that we have of him attached to the court is 1660 or 1659 actually. Or that's the date that I have. So.
And one more thing.
Yeah.
I have a litho, and I'm not sure who is the engraver. It could be Benoit. I believe it's A, first initial. And it says, à son Altesse Royale, Monseigneur Philippe d'Orléans, Duc de Chartres.
Okay.
So would that be an 18th century? Because there are two Duc de Chartres that are known.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I will have to actually see it to know exactly where to place it in terms of chronologically. But is it in a metal format or okay?
Metal. It's a wood frame, fairly plain, and I have a feeling that the litho has been reproduced many times, but this one it's probably an original.
I mean, if it's a litho that cannot be from the 17th century or even most of the 18th century, so it may be a later copy of an earlier design, I think, but I would probably have to see it in person. I mean, we can chat about that after. Pamela first, and then the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I love this last connection to Madame Tussauds. That's pretty amazing. But my question is about what you think réparer means and why you assumed that it implies casting. I mean, one can see how you might, but I mean, is there any evidence that actually these wax figures were primarily cast and not, they might have been, the large structure was cast, but, they would have to be sculpted and modeled, right? And certainly the small portraits were not cast. I don't see how that would even come into it because there's so much addition that you have to, réparer that you have to do to it, I guess. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit, of course, about the making, Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I ended up doing this project is thanks to you. So I'm very happy to hear your questions. So I hear two questions. One is about réparer, and then the other one is about sort of, whether casting was the primary method. Réparer, at least based on my sort of search through key sort of artistic treatises of that period, I saw Reparé showing up mostly in discussions of casting, mostly bronze actually. So that's the only reason I sort of chose it for now, but I still think that there is something to be said about it. And then I see that, Pamela, you have a response to this. And then to the idea of casting, I am tempted to think that it's something that most people assumed about these portraits, or there's a weird slippage where even as early as Philippe Bien sort of assuming that wax portraits absolutely had to be taken after a face, just like a death mask, and in fact. Later on, Madame Tussauds would actually play this up as she sort of tells the stories of how she ran to to Marat when he was assassinated and just took a death mask. But the truth of the matter is Madame Tussauds was actually a pretty decent sculptor. Mm-hmm. Like she actually would start with a clay model, and then she would make a mold over it in plaster and then cast wax, and then she would do the réparé or the further refining. So I am tempted to think that direct casting over face rarely happened. It was just something that was assumed. And also the idea of taking a mold after Louis XIV's face 17 times, that just simply cannot happen. So, but anyway, Pamela, you have...
Well, it's just so interesting to think that the casting was played up in, and yet was also, presumably implying greater naturalism or contact with the person and all that implied, but that it also left it open to a kind of mechanical criticism of being mechanical techniques. So it's an interesting slippage, and that I think you could do more with. And on Reparé, there's actually an interesting essay in the edition that a French scholar built on your work on black wax, and actually has a whole meditation on Reparé. So anyway, I will point that. I will send you a link to that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Which...
You're talking about the rhetorical uses of these.
Yes. Yes.
Criticism about whether this is an actual technical description or a way that was positioning.
Yeah.
Just skeptical.
I think it may have been both. Yeah.
It's
right.
hard to associate it. Yes, it could be seen as mechanical, but it also in some ways associates these portraits with a monumental permanent bronze, which is very prestigious.
That's true.
It's operating between those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. No.
And then over there, yeah.
In terms of preservation, the object in question, the wax profile, it is so three-dimensional. I mean, you see the shoulder of the coat, you see the silk, formerly blue, lace under the silk, the hair. Was there a kind of domed glass covering this? Because otherwise, it would be to the elements, as it were. How is it initially presented? Under glass? I mean, it's framed, it's 3 feet tall. Was it glassed over? And secondly, was he ever truly a valet de chambre, or was that an honorific?
So, great questions. Thank you for those. First, it is assumed that there must have been a glass cover, but the thing is, when the curators at the Versailles decided to actually take a close look at it, analyze it, and do as much conservation treatment as possible. And this was for the King is Dead, or the Le Roi est Mort exhibition, celebrating was a tercentenary of Louis XIV's death back in 2015, I believe. They went through it, and my understanding is that by that point, the glass, I mean, there is glass, it's just that the glass was considered to have been a 19th century replacement.
Was it flat glass? I mean,
it was definitely flat glass. That's
really?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the frame actually comes up quite a bit. Okay. Yeah. So it's a really deep frame, and it also goes back further. So there's some indication that maybe when it was first displayed, wherever it may have been sort of almost built into the wall.
It's almost like a shadow box.
Almost like a shadow box.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And valet de chambre?
So valet de chambre, that's actually mostly an honorific. A lot of ordinary painters to the king usually received that title, but some did work as valet de chambre, but at the same time, it's unclear whether Benoit actually did perform that function. So, over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions around the materiality that I find really fascinating, this discussion um, of what this material was and what its affordances were, and then how it was perceived. And I think something that Pamela was bringing up, about the question of whether, how could these be cast? There's something up there, right, about the indexicality that's very different maybe from another kind of material like marble or like porcelain, right? That this, I was joking to somebody on my way in that you just want to poke this portrait.
I want to as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree,
And so I guess what I don't know if I have, this is terrible. I should be asking a real question. I don't know if I have a real question, but I guess I'm wondering if you've thought about, that's my question. I'm wondering if you have thought about how this material kind of toggles between high and low, in the sense of something that's actually very tactile, something that people would have been familiar with touching and manipulating themselves in their private lives, and something that shows these kind of imperfections. So, I mean, as you implied, right, a marble face is a very different thing than this face where you can see all of the stubble and the pockmarks. And I think too, I think at this time I have to check, but another use for this material is the faces of dolls, right?
Yeah,
and that's something that I've been interested in. But when you see them, they are often they're battered, right? Because children have played with them, and that material doesn't hold up very well. And so I wonder about that too, this kind of impulse to touch, and yet the prohibition from touching, especially with the glass and the frame and the shadow box. But whether that's that kind of tactility and the sort of what that means about the contact with the sitter, right? How if one feels like one can have more contact with the sitter by kind of imagining touching the surface of something that we're all very familiar with touching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
I was wordy.
Okay, so let me actually sort of tease out two issues as I'm hearing it. One is about the high-low, and then the other one is about tactility.
Yeah.
So in terms of high-low, I think we have to be very careful. I don't know whether we can actually say wax was considered to be a low material, or at least used in this context. I mean, one thing that I just did not go into at all, because it would just open up a huge Pandora's box, is that we have several other cases of almost full-length, almost life-size wax figures at various European courts. If you have ever been to Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen, they have a whole bunch. They have like 3 usually on display, and then they have, I mean, England actually has had a few. Actually, at this point, we do know that there were a few that Benoit might have made for the English court at that point. And then, of course, the whole idea of Catherine the Great, a few decades later, commissioning an Italian artist to create a wax, image of Peter the Great. So one thing that I want to sort of push further as I develop this project is to really question whether wax could be considered as a low material within this context. I mean, it seems that the idea of a royal portraiture in wax was already well established. It's hard to determine the origins because a lot of it comes from funerary practices, but it's hard to sort of determine whether audiences would see it and it's like, oh, that's wax, that's cheap material, or that's not as noble as marble. I think it might have required different set of assumptions or values. Now, in terms of access and
More about that, read Charles' dissertation. Multiple valences.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my question maybe was more about the sort of familiarity, and maybe that's
Mm,
what leads into the tactility question, is that, you know, people weren't necessarily playing with marble at home, but but they would have candles, they might have dolls,
right.
this very, you know, something that they knew quite intimately in a different
Yeah.
context.
No, that's a good point, and I think I will sort of make a couple of comments before we conclude, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions in person. But in terms of tactility, as you can see, Curtius' salon had a balustrade, which also is really interesting because it's the kind of balustrade, even in this very rudimentary print, it's the kind of balustrade that you would see in a royal bedroom. And so there is already a kind of that idea of access to the king's body and demarcating your position vis-a-vis the king's body, even within this. So I think it's absolutely exactly, yeah, and, exactly. So I think even with the Benoit's exhibition, it is more likely that the viewers were not allowed to walk through and actually touch. I think it's something that is likely to have been viewed. Now, that being said, there's one aspect that I just did not go into because it would have added another long passage without any image on the slide. Who wants that? But I've actually gathered a few records of using wax masks at royal festivities. There's a very famous ball around 1702 where four members of the royal family showed up wearing this huge cape with one opening, and each one was wearing wax masks created after their likenesses. And they kept changing these faces during the party, confusing everyone. So it's a fantastic story. I wish I could tell you about this. It's just that I have no image of it. But as you can see, by the early 18th century, clearly wax had already become something of a party trick, as much as it had been a material for a very novel kind of royal portraiture. So I just wanted to say that. But I think on the notes, we can sort of conclude and then continue the conversation. Thank you.